Well, they say play to your strengths, and maybe DC has finally learned that trying to be Marvel is not one of their strengths. So Geoff Johns came out and basically said exactly what I was really hoping DC and Warner Brothers would do, which is that he said that following Justice League, they're basically going to be de-emphasizing the importance of the connectivity of the films. Now, he didn't go so far as to say they're abandoning the cinematic universe, but there's definitely going to be a lot less emphasis on it. Why? Well, I'd say that's a really easy call. Their most critically successful, universally praised, and made way more money with a much less marketing push than, say, BVS or Suicide Squad had, was Wonder Woman. And that one has the loosest connections, the fewest tie-ins to the overall franchise. And I'm hoping that they're realizing that one of the things that was damaging to some of their other properties, definitely in the case of Batman v Superman, was that in trying to balance building a bigger universe and telling a story, they sacrificed a lot of the story end, trying to build a bigger and bigger universe. I mean, do we have to remember how insanely awkward and crammed in literally having one of your characters open up a little media file with like 3 back-to-back teasers of movies that are supposed to happen later? So in my mind, this is a good thing, because if DC movies are going to start succeeding at all, they need to be their own thing. And I don't just mean in terms of tone, because I know the people who have chosen to favor DC over Marvel have been saying the whole time, DC is doing its own thing, except it hasn't been. It's been doing its own thing tone-wise, taking a decidedly different feel to what Marvel is doing, but as far as what they were trying to do, the bigger picture, they were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to build a cinematic universe. They had their eye on something bigger than just bringing these characters to life. And that didn't serve them well. I mean, not to overpraise the guy, but basically, DC never had a Kevin Feige in terms of someone with their eyes on this who understood the plan and was overseeing it. Theoretically, Geoff Johns had that role, but I really feel like the rest of Warner Brothers as an entity never got out of his way, if he ever had the qualifications to do it at all, which he very well might have. But I really feel like Warner Brothers, the top executives, never took their hands off this thing. So they didn't have someone to oversee it that they were going to trust to do it. So without that, they really needed to scrap again, they're not scrapping entirely, but they really needed to get off this big shared universe kick. And that appears to be exactly what they're doing. And that, in my mind, wonderful thing, because now we can focus on getting really good individual films, building really good franchises around specific characters, and not getting hung up on how is this going to tie into the next Justice League movie? Does this introduce things that we can then spin off? Just tell a good story. Just focus. And again, even if you liked Batman v Superman, you cannot with a straight face tell me that it was 100% focused on its narrative. You can see the stitches where all these things were put in strictly for the purposes of rushing the building of a bigger universe and setting up stuff that is supposed to pay off later. So even if you like the core narrative, there's still a bunch of stuff there that is completely vestigial to the main story being told. So they need to get off all of that. And I really do think we have the success of Wonder Woman to thank for this, because that movie had fantastic legs at the box office in terms of just going and going and going week over week over week. It didn't open as big as the other movies, but it had much less drop off. Audiences liked it better. The critics liked it better. And don't shout at me over audiences love BVS and Suicide Squad. They didn't. More of them liked it than the critics did. I'll give you that. But it was, even amongst fans, incredibly divisive, both those films. Wonder Woman really wasn't. That's not me saying Wonder Woman's perfect either. It's not a perfect film. There are people who don't like it, but just let me talk in the broad strokes here, because these are the truths. So I will be curious to see if the people who have already been on board with DC up to this point are going to laud this as a good move or a bad move. Because for me, as someone who likes DC characters but has not been enjoying the DC extended cinematic universe, I think this is a great move. So I'm curious, and I haven't checked really, in terms of what the reaction from people who actually were backing the cinematic universe think about that. Do they consider this to be a defeat? Do they think of this as DC throwing in the towel? I don't know, but DC has the potential, and has always had the potential, to make better individual films than Marvel will do. And I honestly believe that. The Dark Knight is better than any individual film that Marvel has put out. But Marvel has built a much better, cohesive, functioning cinematic universe. That is Marvel's strength at this point. Because looking at individual films, I don't think they've made a bad movie. They've had some bad Netflix shows, but I don't think Marvel has made a bad movie. But even their best films are really fun popcorn movies, but most of them don't stay with you too much longer. And that's not necessarily criticism. That's, again, I'm just stating what I feel is very much the fact. And I love Marvel. I've been really enjoying it, but it is the way that the individual pieces build to a bigger whole, and Marvel really has created something greater than the sum of its parts. Whereas DC honestly has individual pieces, and I'm talking more about the core characters that they have to work with, that I think are by and large better than the pieces Marvel has to work with. But I think it's been shown at this point that for whatever reason, I'm going to blame just the studio structure of Warner Brothers, but for whatever reason, they haven't been able to fit those pieces into a bigger whole. So the best thing to do is to let those pieces all shine on their own, which will truly allow DC to be legitimately doing its own thing. For once, finally doing this, they can say, we're not just chasing Marvel. Because they kind of said that before, but did anybody really believe it? But now they can truly be said to be doing their own thing. Additionally, beyond just the move, because the move's not a huge shock, given a lot of the stuff we've heard up to this point. We've heard that the Batman movie is being treated as a standalone, not out of continuity, but not deliberately building to a next film. We know about the Joker movie that is going on, which supposedly is going to have a completely different person playing the Joker, and it's going to be completely out of continuity. So all the indications were there that this was the move. I do like that they've actually codified it and made it official, so that there doesn't have to be the petty fanboy argument of they're abandoning the cinematic universe. No, they're not. They haven't said they are. No, again, not flat out abandoning, but they're de-emphasizing it. And this will hopefully free up the resources and the talent and just the effort to be put into the individual films. Because I think Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, demonstrably already, these are characters that are greater and more impactful than I think anything Marvel's gotten its stable. I mean, and on a personal level, I do like a lot of Marvel characters more. I love Spider-Man. I adore characters like She-Hulk and Squirrel Girl. But even if they got movies, I don't think that they could reach the height of something like The Dark Knight, something like the Richard Donner Superman. These characters are true icons, and what can be done with them if they are truly properly focused on and not seen as a cog in the machine, but allowed to shine on their own, is, I think, at a higher level, potentially, especially if DC goes back to what it was doing prior to trying to force everything into a cinematic universe, which was getting auteur visionary directors and then basically leaving them alone. Things have gotten at their worst with the DC films the more involved that Warner Brothers have been. We saw that back with the Batman stuff, because Joel Schumacher coming in, that was Warner Brothers' move. And that's not me saying Batman Returns was brilliant. I actually have a lot of problem with Batman Returns, but you can see how the switch in tone and feel and everything was a complete knee-jerk studio move. And then, you know, there's Man of Steel, which, again, I don't particularly love, but did feel like more of somebody's vision. When Batman v Superman, I can see Snyder's fingerprints on it, but so much of what is shoved in there feels like it was studio mandated. Suicide Squad, we know the story of that production, what a mess that was. They get somebody like David Ayer, who has the skill set, who has the ambition, who has the talent and the vision. They give him this incredibly short time to work with. They take the movie away from him in the edit. Warner Brothers, the studio, needs to back off. And I think that if they're no longer trying to build a grander cinematic universe, they might be willing to do that. At the very least, with some of these things, some of the more ancillary properties. Because I would like to think that if they're not trying to cram it in and make sure it fits into this bigger monstrosity that wasn't working, that they'll leave Joss Whedon alone to make Batgirl, that they'll leave Chris McKay alone to make Nightwing. And I think that the best version of those projects is going to be the one where the studios more or less leave them alone. And oddly enough, this is kind of how I've always felt about Marvel as a comics line versus DC as a comics line. I think that DC has better individual characters than Marvel does. However, I like the overall world feel of Marvel much more than I do DC. And that's not me saying one is definitively better. This is just my own personal assessment, but I am now sort of feeling like maybe the films and those franchises are going to settle into a similar place where Marvel has, you know, this big sort of sandbox playground that I kind of just enjoy dwelling in, whereas DC has individual characters that I feel are on their own stronger as individuals. And if the film series can settle into that similar dynamic that I think the comic books have already been doing for a while, that works for me because it'll give me two distinctly different flavors of superheroes as opposed to DC trying to do what Marvel did, but just make sure that the tone was completely different. And yeah, and that especially didn't work in that case because it was a tone that it turned out a fair amount of the audience didn't want. But when you decide that's the tone of your entire universe, it doesn't free you up to do individual franchises that break from it. Whereas Wonder Woman was the one that was very differently of a different tone, and they let it be that because it was a prequel and didn't have to mesh quite as much with the tone and the feel. So what does this mean in the more immediate sense? Well, I mean, Justice League at this point is going to be whatever it is. Aquaman, hard to say, but because that's already in production as well. I would be curious to see if the Flash movie still is Flashpoint, because Flashpoint really only makes sense as a story if you are working in a larger cinematic universe, or as I previously theorized, using it as a way to reset or correct that universe. But if they're just going to de-emphasize the shared universe at all, I have to wonder if they're still going to do Flashpoint as a storyline, because now it seems like it's not necessary if you're just going to disregard the DCEU when it doesn't suit your needs. And again, that's a move I support. I mean, that's how we got Logan. Logan doesn't fit into X-Men continuity properly if you really want to be tight and nitpicky about it. But they said, who cares? This is the best story. And that's what I want to see Warner Brothers and DC start doing. Get somebody who cares about the characters. Let them make the best. I mean, you know, get a pitch from them. Make sure it is not completely out of whack with what makes sense for the character. But then let them do whatever makes the best story. To heck with how well it fits with anything else. So I consider this a good move. What are your thoughts on DCEU de-emphasizing the extended universe portion of that acronym? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, check me out on Twitter at Council of Geeks. Give a listen to the Council of Geeks podcast, available on iTunes and Stitcher. And until next time, this council is adjourned.